Welcome, everyone, and you are listening to The Last Dinosaur, and I'm your host, Chris Aversano. On today's podcast, we have Joe Hughes, owner, chairman of Shipowners Claims Bureau. This company manages the American P&amp Club, Eagle Ocean Marine, and Eagle Ocean America through Eagle Ocean Agencies, Inc. In today's episode of Tell Me More Tuesday, we're going to talk about marine insurance, and in particular P&amp clubs and how they work. Joe, welcome to the podcast.
Thank you, Chris.
It's great. It's great having you, and it was good to see you recently at the CMA trade show. It's always a good one, and thank you for coming on. So, for those that don't know Joe, he has a great and wonderful background. But so tell everybody who's listening what makes you an expert in today's topic of marine insurance and P&amp Club.
Well, I've been around in the industry for a long time, actually, Chris. It's a total of 46 years now. And I've done most things within the marine insurance domain. For the last 27, 28 years, as I think you've noted, I've been the chairman, and for 27 of those 28 years, chief executive of SCB, which manages the American Club and does other things in the marine insurance space. But prior to that, I've been an underwriter, I've been a broker at Lloyd's, and I have experience of all the major marine insurance markets in the world: London, Scandinavia, continental Europe, Asia, and of course the United States as well. So I've been around the block a few times, you might say.
Yeah, I mean, you have a wonderful breadth of experience, and I think that's something that when we talked off kind of before we got going is it's such a wide part of the industry, and I've had many guests say, well, I'm an expert in my part of maritime. To the outside world, I'm a maritime expert, but to the inside, I don't know anything about insurance, which has made me think about bringing you on. So just kind of talk a little bit of the difference between, we hear different types of insurance. You have the overall umbrella of a marine insurance, you have hull, you have cargo. Talk a little bit about that difference, because I think that's kind of where there is, for the uninitiated, some definitely some confusion.
Well, I think there are three major domains in the world of marine insurance: hull and machinery, which is property insurance for the ship owner. The ship owner will insure his ship and its machinery for the property risks that they entail. There is protection and indemnity cover, or liability cover, against those exposures that a ship owner will have in regard to trading his vessel. And then there is cargo insurance. Now, cargo insurance really is quite different from the first two areas that I mentioned, in the sense that it has a very different constituency of insureds. They are people who own cargo that is being transported from point A to point B. And of course, part of that transport will entail carriage by sea, but they are the users of ship owner services rather than ship owners themselves in the ordinary way. So that is not so much a salty end, as it were, of the marine insurance domain. It's quite separate from the two major insurance areas that ship owners require: hull and machinery for the property risks, and P&I for the liability risks.
And I think that's where some of the interesting part of the hull and the machinery, I would imagine, functions a little bit easier to imagine. That's more of the like getting your car insurance or things like that, right? That's basically where that is.
Yes, and it's done traditionally in the commercial markets, Lloyd's of London probably being the most well-known of those markets. And which, of course, still functions as a very important market for hull and machinery risks. But these risks can be placed all over the world. Scandinavia is a very important market for hull and machinery, continental Europe, Asia increasingly. Not so much in the United States these days, I'm sorry to say. It is a very important market. It's conducted mainly on what they call a subscription basis. So a number of underwriters will take a line, typically of a whole risk, and be responsible for that percentage of the whole risk when a loss occurs. P&I cover, by contrast, for all kinds of interesting historical reasons that I'll touch upon in a moment, has traditionally been offered by protection and indemnity clubs. These are mutual institutions run on a not-for-profit basis. that, as I mentioned a moment ago, have quite an interesting history. The idea of mutually insuring marine risks actually goes back as far as the Phoenicians, probably. And in fact, in more recent times, the idea of mutuality was quite common in England from the 16th century onwards, mainly in relation to property and fire risks at that time. But it started to impinge on the markets for marine insurance in the early 18th century. There was legislation at that time that created a duopoly of two company insurers, the London Insurance and the Royal Exchange Insurance, that created rather uncompetitive circumstances for ship owners across the United Kingdom. And they started forming mutuals for the insurance of their hull risks and not using the large insurers, including Lloyd's actually, in London at that time. All that changed at the beginning of the 19th century with the repeal of the legislation that had been enacted in the early part of the 18th century. And hull became much more competitive across the marine insurance world. However, the idea of mutuality was not forgotten. And in the 1830s and 40s in the United Kingdom, there were new liabilities being created by Act of Parliament and certain decisions of the courts in England that started to build up considerable areas of liability risk for ship owners that had never really been in evidence before. And the ship owners needed to get cover for this, but the traditional property underwriters at Lloyd's and elsewhere were rather reluctant to accept some of these risks, which they didn't completely understand. So from the mid-1850s onwards, the first P&I, originally they were called protection clubs, and indemnity clubs later, and then they were merged with protection and indemnity clubs, started to form in the United Kingdom to cover these new third-party liability risks. And from these origins, the modern world of protection and indemnity insurance has developed. Most of the clubs that now form the international group of P&I clubs, which I'll talk about in further detail in a moment, had their origins from about 1855 through to the beginning of the 20th century until about 1910. We were founded, the American Club, in 1917. At the moment, within the international group, the modern clubs that account for about 90% of all world shipping in terms of liability insurance, there are 12 clubs. There are 7 in the United Kingdom. There are 3 in Scandinavia. There's 1 in Japan. And then there's us here in the United States. So we're a bit unique and very proud of it on this side of the Atlantic.
What would be a good example of a P&I risk? So hull risk is very easy to understand. It's you know, the machinery, the hull, the anchor, anything like that. P&I risk a little more nebula. You mentioned third party, things like that.
Yes.
Talk a little bit about that, because I think that would be a really useful benefit for our listeners and for me, because I'm very curious to hear how that falls in.
Well, indeed. I mean, you've got to imagine the idea of third-party liability risk. In other words, if you are a ship owner, you're carrying other people's cargo, and you have an obligation to deliver it at the destination of the voyage in the same condition as which it was loaded. If you do not do that, if there is water damage to the cargo or shortages or other kinds of deterioration, then you may be liable for that. You will have crew, and sometimes in the case of other ships, passengers on board who may die or fall ill or be injured. That is a typical P&I risk. You may collide with another ship. Depending upon the nature of your hull cover, a proportion of that risk may fall to you as the ship owner as a liability. You may collide with a dock. That will create a liability for which you have an obligation. You may have an oil pollution. You may have a wreck, and there may be an order from a local authority to remove that wreck. All these liability risks are typically covered by protection and indemnity insurance.
And this will be actually, typically, it sounds like a higher value than the hull, right? Because the hull is, well, this is the machinery, this is how old it is, and you could go to anybody, a shipbroker or somebody who gives valuations, and there it is, and you can insure for. the P&I gets a little bit more nebula, I think.
Well, it does. I mean, you can have a P&I risk, or rather a P&I liability that far exceeds the value of the hull. You know, a major oil pollution, for example, or a serious dock damage. And in those circumstances, yes, the liability exposure may be considerably greater than the hull value. If you look at, for example, a well-known, somewhat notorious claim in recent years, the Costa Concordia, the ship itself was valued at about $500 million, but the cost of removing the wreck and all the incidental charges in relation to that were about 3 times greater. They were in total about $1.5 billion. So it goes to show that even with the highest valued vessels, you can have a very disproportionately large liability arising from an accident that entails those risks.
Right, and that becomes then where the mutual the mutual kind of pays that out. Explain kind of how those clubs work and how, because I think that's where it's a little interesting, rather than, you know, as a driver, you have automobile risk, you do all this, you have, whether it's, you know, the Hartford, Progressive, Allstate, you have these folks. Here it's a little different because you actually can be very wealthy individuals or companies that underwrite each of these risks.
Yes, indeed. And this is where the principle of mutuality in the P&I world is so important. The group clubs are mutuals. In other words, the insurers are the insureds, and they run on a not-for-profit basis under the basic equation that each premium and investment income equals claims outgo, reinsurance, and the cost of management, very simply put. And they're not designed to make profits, but they're designed to offer what is effectively at-cost insurance for the members of the club. Within the international group, each mutual year begins on February the 20th, which is...
I remember that because there are some certificates, the CLC, I think it is.
Oh, yeah, CLC.
Yep, the CLC, as a shipbroker, the CLC, you always had to be careful in that February timeframe. Hey, you know, on this voyage that's going to expire, we need to make sure you have your February 20th. I haven't fixed
Indeed,
the ship.
I know. Well,
7
actually,
years.
It's supposed to have derived from a very old practice in Hanseatic times, when February the 20th was the date at which the Baltic was considered to be ice-free, and therefore old insurances of hulls would have a differential rate between the laid-up period while while there was still ice in the Baltic until February the 20th, and then February the 20th and after, when it was considered to be open for navigation again.
That's a great trivia question.
It's something that the clubs have always had. It's something of a peculiarity that creates an immense amount of activity within the entirety of the group, all the clubs, from about the end of November until the end of February. Whenever
it's a great thing, because it definitely goes from a rubber hits the road, getting a ship fixed, especially on the tanker side. That certificate is passed all the time, and you know, the smart, you know, you become used to it. You go, oh, wait a minute, we're fixing a ship in January. The, you know, voyage is going to go to the first week of March. You know, how do we send it? Can you get it early? Whatever it is, but we always have to have that. It's a real interesting nautical reason why.
Yes, it is actually. And as I say, it goes back many years. But the other interesting thing about the clubs, of course, is that they are ultimately directed by their shipowner members. All the clubs will have a board of directors that represents, for the most part, it's ship owners, and they will typically meet. I'm just talking about the American clubs practice now, but it's fairly common across the industry as a whole. They will typically meet 4 times a year, and they will go through an agenda that looks at, you know, the claims, the underwriting performance, the development of policy years, investment performance, and so on of the club. And the managers, if you have independent managers, as we are at Shipowners Claims Bureau, will report to the board on the affairs of the club during, you know, the time since the last board meeting. And the relationship, therefore, between the managers and their boards of directors with the clubs is very close and very symbiotic. We're all pulling in the same direction for the benefit of the members as a whole. It is interesting to know, I mentioned the international group, that with the international group of P&I clubs, which makes up, as I mentioned earlier, those 12 clubs these days, who form this association of common interest within the individual clubs. It operates as a kind of super club for the individual clubs themselves, and it cooperates a great deal on issues of policy, and most importantly, it shares reinsurance arrangements. This is the key to the manner in which the group operates. At present, each club within the international group retains $10 million for its own account of any one claim. Beyond $10 million, up to $100 million, that is to say a stretch of $90 million, those claims that exceed 10 go into what's known as the international group pool, and they are shared ratably among the clubs in accordance with a formula that depends on tonnage, premium, and record over time by the clubs within the group. Beyond 100 million, the clubs collectively purchase reinsurance on a very, very large scale, all the way up to billions of dollars worth of cover, $1 billion plus for oil pollution, up to $3 billion for passenger and crew claims. Ultimately, beyond that, for all other claims, up to a possible ceiling of around about $8 or $9 billion in an area known as overspill, which means, as you can detect, that the level of cover available to members of international group clubs is at the very, very highest level imaginable. And they do this in cooperation with each other for the betterment of the collective interests of all members within the pool and the group.
And ultimately, those are people who are transporting your goods and cargoes and things like that to make sure that they have an umbrella to kind of fall back on.
Indeed. And you mentioned CLC certificates of financial responsibility a moment ago. One of the trends of the last several years, of course, has been the growing requirement for proof of insurance in a variety of different areas. The CLC was related chiefly to oil pollution for tankers, but now there are certificates required for bunker pollution, for Maritime Labor Convention liabilities. The ISM and ISPS codes have come into play also. And in that particular context, the international group clubs have played an enormous role in providing proof of cover, well, providing cover in the first instance, providing proof of cover as a basis for the obtaining of those certificates, without which a ship owner can't trade internationally at all. So having a good, strong P&I insurance is absolutely vital, not just in the sense of, commercial prudence, but in terms of being able to trade. And that's where P&I clubs are vitally important to the entire system of global maritime trade.
It's a fascinating part, and I think that you gave me a great lesson in kind of how that all works and how that all fits together. Because even from sitting on a very commercial point of view and now sitting on the software side, I mean, you hear about insurance, you hear about that, and it's like, okay, it's part of what they do, but to get a little bit of an in-depth look at it is super important, because it's a key function. It's like, you would have, if you're a business owner, you need to have insurance, and it may not be as complex if you run a printing shop, but maybe it's more complex if you run the ink producer, right? Because now you have you have a risk of pollution, and you're manufacturing. It's a different story.
True, it is, absolutely.
And versus, me just driving my car, right? I mean, they're all different things. Before we go, one thing is what would you say to somebody looking to get into the maritime space and they say, I want to do insurance? I don't know if anybody would say anything unless they do anyway, but what would you say? Because I think it's fascinating. And I look back at my career, I kind of was attracted to the commercial side, but this is really interesting. And there's a lot of layers to the onion.
There are many layers to the onion, Chris. You're absolutely right there. And you can enter the marine insurance world through a variety of different avenues. The P&I clubs typically, at least in my day, I mean, I started in 1977 and I qualified originally as a barrister in the United Kingdom. And I did my pupillage at a maritime commercial set of chambers. And in those days, that was a very sort of sexy thing in the legal world to be involved in. That's where everything was sort of happening at that time. And there had always been, actually, within the London clubs in particular, something of a direct conduit from the bar to senior management positions at the big P&I clubs in London. And I was part of that conveyor belt, I suppose, way back when. I'm pleased to say, though, that in more recent years, the clubs have become much more diverse, both in relation to the people whom they employ and from the backgrounds of people that now work for the P&I clubs. There's still quite a heavy legal component within the personnel of P&I clubs across the world, because the liabilities that you're dealing with obviously can be quite complex and technical, and a knowledge of maritime law is very helpful. But here at the American Club and the management company, for example, we have people from all kinds of different backgrounds. In addition to lawyers, we have master mariners, we have accountants, we have people with doctorates in marine engineering. We have all kinds of people, many of them with very practical experience of being involved in the maritime industry. So I don't think that there is more salty an area of marine insurance than the P&I clubs, but equally hull insurers, draw from similar backgrounds to the P&I clubs. And a very good way, I would suggest, from getting in, to know more about marine insurance generally from the get-go, an excellent training is to join a broking house. A broking house, that is an insurance broking house that has experience of all the different disciplines within the marine insurance sphere. So there are many ways of getting into the marine insurance business. And I can tell you, it's probably one of the most interesting, international, edifying, and intellectually challenging areas you'll ever find, I think, in any area of industry.
The way you're framing that, maybe you'll get some phone calls after this about, hey, I've always wanted to do this, and this is fantastic. But as a quick side note, there was almost a path that I was going to end up at an insurance broking house at one point. There was almost, I went one way instead of going the other. But maybe that would have been interesting. I know a few of my classmates, I went to Fort Schuyler, are involved in the marine insurance, whether at the P&I club, broking houses.
We have Fort Schuyler graduates, I'm very proud to say, here.
I know it, and all the schools I know are super supportive.
Yes.
You guys, the insurance is definitely an area, certainly that is very large for that cadre of all the maritime schools. Joe, this has been a fantastic, I don't want to say chat. It was an education, and I hope that people listen to it, feel the same way. You were able to distill. What did we decide? 500, 700 years worth of insurance in a short 20 minutes.
Well, maybe going back to the Phoenicians even actually, Chris. But I tell you, no, it's a huge subject, and it's a bit of a challenge to put it all into 20 or 25 minutes of conversation. But I hope that I've given you at least a flavour of it all. And if anybody wants to make phone calls, having listened to the podcast, we're delighted to hear from people.
Absolutely. And I'll include the link to all the companies that you represent within the show notes and the newsletter. So they should be able to reach out, as well as your LinkedIn profile. Joe, thank you for coming on the podcast. I do appreciate it.
Thank you very much indeed, Chris. Much enjoyed talking with you.
Thank you for listening to this episode of The Last Dinosaur with our guest, Joseph Hughes, an expert in marine insurance. If you enjoyed our discussion, be sure to follow our podcast for more insights to the latest trends and technologies in the maritime industry. Once again, I'm your host, Chris Aversano, wishing you fair winds and following seas.